Hi, everyone. I'm Kalen Ferris. I'm a research software engineer here at IBM Quantum. And today, what I'm going to be talking to you about is sort of introducing what you need to know to start thinking about quantum simulation using quantum computers. So let's go ahead and just dive in. The way this lecture is going to be set up is it's going to be sort of set up in two different parts. I'm going to lecture at you with a few slides for a little while, and then I'm going to go into a sort of practical kind of code example just to kind of get your feet wet with this kind of like vast field of quantum simulation. So the first kind of part of this sort of lecture is going to be reviewing some of the kind of like foundational things for quantum mechanics, the postulates of quantum mechanics, where the formalism sort of like sits on, and start just sort of a quick review of some of the math tools that are behind a lot of quantum mechanics. After that, what we'll do is I'll talk a little bit about what do we mean when we say quantum simulation? What are the types of problems that we're trying to solve when we say we're simulating quantum systems or trying to understand them or characterize or study them? Not in a lab, but on a computer or a quantum computer. And then I'll talk a little bit about some of the classical approaches that have been used in the past. I won't have time to go into, it's quite a vast field. So I won't have time to go into too many of them, but I'm going to briefly overview a couple of them. And then with that kind of introductory stuff kind of out of the way, what we'll do is we'll actually go in and start thinking about, okay, how do I simulate a quantum system using a quantum computer? We'll talk about how to prepare quantum simulation algorithms, what goes into that, the kind of like anatomy of the workload, and then spend a little bit of time thinking about this idea of trying to figure out how to map a problem or some, quantum mechanical system to a quantum computing environment. And then the last part of it will be, I'll just kind of give a brief overview of some of the kind of canonical approaches that people are using now to simulate quantum systems using quantum computers. A lot of these you'll see later on in the next 2 weeks. And so I'm just going to give like kind of like a quick overview. And then, like I said, we'll go in and do like a practical code example on a relatively simple problem. And we'll look at, what we can start doing with like Qiskit and the related sort of software tools. Cool. So let's go ahead and get started. So like I said, what I want to do is go over a sort of review of a lot of the core concepts. And the way I want to start that is by going over the sort of postulates of quantum mechanics and sort of like the kind of 5 basic assumptions or like working ideas that build the foundation for how we, describe and study quantum mechanical systems. So Olivia did a really good job last time, I think, kind of giving the history and the core concepts. And I think this will hopefully give you a little more meat to kind of like latch onto. So like I said, these postulates of quantum mechanics rest upon these sort of 5 basic postulates, which enable us to understand how quantum states evolve in time, how they're described at any particular given time, as well as how to calculate the various physical quantities from this quantum state. So how do we describe mathematically what an experimentalist would do in a lab, for example? And so the tools that we'll kind of quickly go over are what we'll use to actually investigate kind of on paper or on a computer how quantum systems evolve, as well as how to actually characterize them. Okay, so the first postulate sort of starts with thinking about how do we actually describe the state of a system? What do we mean when we're saying we have a quantum state in some quantum system? And so mathematically, what we do is we describe the state of any physical system by a state vector. And so this is a column vector that contains a lot of different elements, which are the quantum amplitudes. They're typically complex numbers. And this state vector is part of a much larger thing called a Hilbert space. And what a Hilbert space is, relatively simply, is it's a vector space that holds all of the possible ways you can describe a particular quantum system, or that the different states that a particular quantum system can be in. And so the state of a particular system is completely described by this state vector, this sort of psi t with a little caret thing in Dirac notation here. And any superposition of this state vector is also a state vector as well. So then the second postulate of this deals with observables and operators. So this postulate starts thinking about, okay, how do I want to describe mathematically what I can do in a lab when I take a measurement of some quantum system? What am I doing from a mathematical description? What am I doing to that system? And so essentially what this says is that for every physically measurable quantity known as an observable, you'll probably hear that word a lot, there is a corresponding thing called a Hermitian operator. It's a detail I can explain later. But this operator forms a complete basis that describes all of the possible states that are associated with this measurable quantity. So for example, this could be the possible values of angular momentum for electron orbiting around an atom, or it could be the possible energy states that a particular system could be in, or something along those lines. So that's kind of the second postulate. The third deals with measurements and eigenvalues. And so when we have a state vector and we have an observable, what happens when when the action of this operator of this observable is applied onto a state vector, is it actually changes the state vector. It returns one of the eigenvalues of that operator, and the resulting state immediately collapses into one of the possible eigenstates that are associated with that operator. So, for example, the way you can think about this is kind of a formal definition of when I try to apply a Hamiltonian to some particular state, I will get back one of my possible energy levels, and my system will be returned into one of the eigenstates of that Hamiltonian, for example. The fourth postulate is this idea of the probabilistic outcome of measurements. So like you all probably know, when we measure wave functions, there is a probabilistic or statistical nature to them. And this postulate kind of describes like what is kind of fundamentally the thing that's happening here. So when you're making a measurement on some state, the probability of one of the eigenvalues of the observable you're using to measure it with is going to be given by this equation, which essentially just says what is the overlap, or how much of my wave function is on top of or overlapping the possible eigenstates. And this gives you a value for the probability for a particular measurement outcome. Then the fifth postulate describes, okay, well, how do these systems evolve in time? So now that we've kind of built this up, we have a description of the state of the system. We have a description of the relevant observables of the system, the probabilistic nature of measurement, and things like that. And this last piece describes, okay, how does this wave function evolve in time? And essentially what this says is the wave function evolves, the way a wave function evolves is governed by this thing called the time-dependent Schrödinger equation, which you've probably seen before if you've taken an undergrad class in quantum mechanics or just kind of around, have been interested in quantum. This is a relatively common equation that you might see. And it has a general solution of this e to the minus I ht. So you're exponentiating the Hamiltonian matrix, which we'll talk a little bit more about how to do that later on, and especially in our practical example. Okay, so the other piece that I want to kind of give another quick overview is just maybe for a lot of you, this might be just a reminder of the different notation and the different mathematical tools that we use to describe quantum systems and quantum mechanics kind of generally. So when we write wave functions, we know kind of fundamentally most of the time, especially in quantum computing, our wave functions are described as these state vectors, as these column vectors, which have elements that correspond to different measurement outcomes. And these numbers are complex numbers known as quantum amplitudes. And these amplitudes are related to, they aren't exactly, but they are related to the probability of measuring, for example, either 0 or 1, based on the square magnitude of that complex number. So we know fundamentally these things are state vectors, and what we often do, especially physicists and chemists and others, will represent these quantum states in this thing called Dirac notation or Bra-Ket notation, where we have these kets which kind of list out all of the, list out the superposition or list out the state in the form of each component. So we have, some amplitude in the 0 state and some amplitude in the 1 state. And we have bras, which are the sort of dual to the ket, which is represented as a row vector, and where we have the amplitudes have been complex conjugated, essentially. We also, when we're describing a wave function or where we're thinking about how do we write down a state vector, we also have to pick a set, a basis or a set of basis states that each element in that vector will represent. So for this really simple example, the two elements of this basis are the 0 and the 1 state, but they could be, a different symbol. They could be either spin up or a spin down, or they could be the occupation of, a hydrogen atom, on one side of a molecule and a carbon atom on the other side of the molecule. Like I said, kind of the basis is how we actually describe a particular wave function. And there are many bases from which we can choose from for a different type of quantum system. Broadly, for a particular Hilbert space. So I'll just give you kind of the formal definition. The basis for a vector space, also called a spanning set, is some set of vectors within a vector space such that any state vector, for example, can be described as a linear combination of each of those components in the set, essentially. And this basically says a superposition of vectors in a basis is also a state in that vector space. The other thing that I want to talk about too is that not only do we have this sort of state vector representation for quantum states, we also have a way to describe the operators, the observables that we use in quantum mechanics. And these will typically have a matrix representation. And their action, what they will do on a particular wave function or a particular state vector, will depend on what the matrix, what the components of that matrix are built from. And so what they might do is they might transform one state to another. They might change the basis that state is represented in, or they might return an eigenvalue, for example, and leave the state unchanged. Oftentimes, when you're simulating quantum systems, the system's Hamiltonian will be written in this sort of matrix way. And this matrix representation is what we typically use when we're sort of very kind of like exactly and kind of analytically trying to understand the possible energy levels of a particular quantum system. So here, what I want to do is just go over a little bit of notation of, a lot of the common operations. A lot of this review you've probably seen before, but I just like to make sure that everybody has kind of a roughly level of foundation when they start thinking about quantum simulation. So in this table, we have the idea of a complex conjugate, which you've probably seen before. You basically take, when you take the complex conjugate of a complex number, you flip the sign of the imaginary component for that number. We also have vectors, aka kets. We have vector duals, aka bras. Those kets and bras have an inner product, which will return some scalar value that is a description of what's called the overlap of those two different vectors. We also have a tensor product, which is how you mathematically describe how to take one quantum state and another quantum state and sort of combine them together into one larger quantum state. We have this other operation called the Hermitian conjugate, or the adjoint of a particular matrix. And essentially what it does is you take the matrix and you take the complex conjugate of all of its elements, and you essentially flip all of the elements along the diagonal of that matrix. And I say that there mostly because Hamiltonian operators need to be this thing called Hermitian. And the next part that I'll talk about is the expectation value, which is what we actually are trying to measure mathematically when we try to characterize or understand quantum systems, typically. Okay, so kind of with that review mostly out of the way, what I want to present to you is kind of this pyramid of quantum simulation. So again, this question of like, what does it mean when I say I'm trying to simulate some quantum system? And the way I've kind of categorized this into these is into these sort of like three different kind of classes or types of problems. There are the problems involving solving for eigenstates or diagonalizing very large matrices. There is the problem of understanding how quantum systems respond and change in time, especially if you put in some stimulus or probe or something along those lines. How does that state evolve after you've perturbed it in some way? And then the third part of this is phase transitions. Like, how does the ground state of the system change as you modify some order parameter like temperature or magnetic field or pressure or some other kind of thing. So to kind of dive into each little piece of this, I want to first talk about eigenstate solvers, because that's kind of the most straightforward approach that has historically been, I would say, probably the most commonly used for characterizing and understanding different quantum systems. And essentially what this does is it says, okay, I've got some quantum system. I've got a Hamiltonian, which is represented as a matrix. I'm going to diagonalize it. And when I diagonalize it, what I get back are all of the energy levels that are possible for my quantum system, all of the associated eigenvalues, which are the actual energies for each of those levels, as well as the eigenstates, which are the states of the system that a wave function will collapse into upon measurement based on some probability or based on the quantum amplitudes of that state. So doing this eigenstate solver thing is fairly straightforward for small matrices. For 2 by 2, it's relatively trivial. As like a quick example, we can look at the Pauli matrices, which you've maybe seen before, and we can diagonalize them. We can find what the eigenvalues and eigenvectors of each of these matrices are. And it just so happens that for each of them, they're either plus minus 1, and the eigenstates sort of have this kind of form, essentially, when you actually do the diagonalization. For matrices of this size, it's relatively straightforward to just diagonalize them and find the eigenvalues and everything that you want. And this will give you a complete description of that particular observable or Hamiltonian. However, the thing that comes up is when we start scaling up the kind of system. So this is a really simple, so the Pauli matrices are like a very simple matrix to solve. But if you start moving into trying to characterize systems that are more complicated, maybe they have a lot of different particles. Maybe what I want to do is, say I have a little lattice of sites and I have electrons that can be either spin up or spin down at each one of these. And I have a description for how those electrons can move from one site to another, or if two electrons are occupying the same site, how they're sort of repelled by each other. And in order to fully describe the entire Hamiltonian of this system, I need a very large matrix. And the size of this matrix actually grows exponentially. And this is kind of the fundamental problem that comes with trying to approach characterizing quantum systems using these eigenstate solvers. At a certain point, diagonalization just becomes too difficult to do because your matrix is just too large. And you require too much memory, too much computing power to actually even try to attempt it. And this is where quantum computers and other kinds of classical approaches come in to attempt to help save the day. So that's eigenstate solvers. That's one class of problems in this kind of arena of quantum simulation. The next part I want to talk about is quantum dynamics. How does a system evolve in time? And so these types of problems are kind of more centered around understanding how quantum systems behave when things interact with each other. And there's sort of a time dependence to how that reaction happens. So say, two organic molecules are coming close to each other and they're going to combine and there's a chemical reaction that will happen. how do I describe that in time as those two molecules come close to each other? And what I'm going to do here is essentially try to solve this or try to find the value of a particular wave function given some time evolution operator. But again, this is also a really difficult thing to calculate if your system is quite large. And so this is another arena with which quantum computers are helpful for. So that's quantum dynamics. And then the last thing in this kind of pyramid of quantum simulation is this idea of phase transitions. And usually when I say phase transition, you may think of, water boiling or becoming a solid or becoming a liquid or maybe a plasma. When we're thinking about phase transitions, classically, usually what we're thinking about is how does this material, how do these molecules, how does this system change its phase as a function of temperature and pressure? And this is a little different from quantum phase transitions, which what these describe is instead of abrupt changes in the way a material is structured or whatever, in the way it behaves, it changes. It describes abrupt changes in the actual ground state of the system. So, for example, what I might have as like a quick, easy, simple example is I might have the ground state of a particular quantum system in some kind of like regular order. So I might have like atoms arranged nicely in a sort of like nice crystalline structure. But as I increase the pressure, as I increase the temperature, or as I modify maybe like a magnetic field or some other kind of order parameter, the ground state of the system will move maybe from this nicely arranged sort of like crystal structure to a disordered state where there isn't a regular crystal structure and atoms are sort of still bonded to each other. It might still be a solid, but there's no long range order to it. So the atoms are sort of randomly arranged to a degree. One of the nice canonical examples that I like to kind of talk about with quantum phase transitions are this transition from a conductor material from being a conductor to a superconductor. And so you may be probably familiar with this, or quantum computers work off of superconductors, where you have some material and at a low enough temperature, a low enough magnetic field, the way current will flow through a material changes from a sort of regular kind of like conductance into having absolutely zero resistance, and you have essentially lossless current transfer. You have a lossless current flow. Yes. Okay. So that is the kind of pyramid of quantum simulation. And the next thing that I kind of want to do is talk about some of the classical approaches to quantum computing. So, for the last, 100 odd years of quantum mechanics, we've mostly just used, pen and paper or, classical computers. And so a lot of these approaches, there's sort of quite a wide domain of things. And I don't really have, the time or space to really dive into all of them. So what I'm going to do here is just talk a little bit about, a couple of them. But the main takeaway that I want to give to you when we're thinking about how do we simulate quantum systems using classical computers is that we still have this problem of if my system that I'm trying to simulate grows too quickly and it becomes completely intractable to try to exactly solve for the eigenstates and the eigenvalues of a particular system, what am I to do? Well, we can make approximations that are, don't fully capture, the physics or the chemistry, but are still useful and still have very strong predictive power and match a lot of what we see in experiment. And two of the ones that I want to talk about are tensor networks, which are a relatively recent and growing in popularity approach to studying and understanding quantum systems, especially ones that have strong correlations or very high entanglement or things like that. And essentially the way this approach kind of works is instead of having my wave function be described as this kind of full vector with, all my quantum amplitudes, and I'm trying to diagonalize an extremely large matrix, I'll represent the wave function of my system as individual tensors, and connect them to each other through, how entangled each of these tensors are. And so this approach has actually led to a lot of really interesting ideas about how quantum systems behave and how many-body physics works, and how strong correlations create weird, interesting collective phenomena in systems. But it does have its own limitations as well. It's still a classical approach. It's still an approximation. There are limits to how high of an entanglement, how strongly correlated your system can be, and still be captured using these sort of tensor network methods. The other one that I'll talk about is kind of a little bit of my background. It's this idea of density functional theory. And so there's a lot of math here, but I wouldn't worry too much about it. I'm not going to go into detail because we're worried about quantum simulation on quantum computers, not on classical computers. But so to kind of give you an idea of like where this comes from and what limitations it has, this is another really popular, powerful simulation tool for physicists to understand how electrons behave in materials. So say I have, a two-dimensional material and I want to understand how it responds to a magnetic field, or I want to run a current across it, or I just want to understand the electronic structure. What do the states look like in this system? Density functional theory provides an approach that is very close to what actually happens and is a very good description of what actually happens in the lab, and has really good predictive power. And it's essentially based on this approximation that instead of taking a material where I'm trying to keep track of all of the individual electrons in some crystal, instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to approximate all of that with a electron density. So instead of many electrons interacting with many other electrons, it's going to be, how does an individual electron interact with this like very nebulous kind of density of charge of electrons, and what kinds of collective phenomena emerge from studying in this way. But it also has some limitations, specifically around the approximations that it's making. So the trouble with density functional theory is that if you don't capture how well a many-body physics problem or a strongly correlated system behaves, and how those electrons interact with each other, especially at sort of very far distances, density functional theory starts losing its predictive power, and it's harder and harder to accurately simulate and predict what a material might behave like when you're simulating these kinds of materials. And so those might be things that are like, heavy atoms that like might have interesting magnetic properties, or topological things, or other stuff like that. Okay, so we have now gone through this kind of introduction to simulating quantum systems, and how we've done it sort of historically. And so now what I want to do is dive into actually thinking about, okay, how do we take these different kinds of quantum simulation problems and use quantum computing to try to solve them? So what I want to first give here is the kind of anatomy of a quantum simulation algorithm, and sort of what each of the individual steps that are needed are in order to solve, an eigenstate solver problem, or a quantum dynamics problem, or I want to look at a phase transition, or I want to characterize my quantum system in some other way. So the first step of this kind of workflow is taking and choosing a quantum system to actually simulate or characterize. I want to take it and understand, like, okay, how am I describing the Hamiltonian? How do I describe the total energy of the system, all of the interactions that are associated with it, and what observables are important to me to try to measure, or am I just interested in the energy of the system, or something along those lines? This first step is sort of, you have to kind of answer those questions for yourself and figure out what is the type of experiment or quantum simulation problem I want to try to solve. And then the next part of this is actually mapping the Hamiltonian and the way you represent the wave function to a quantum computing environment. So this includes doing potentially, transforming the operators that make up the Hamiltonian in terms of Pauli or spin-based operators. Essentially, need to express or transcribe the way you write your Hamiltonian on pen and paper onto the operations you can actually accomplish on a quantum computer. And this is, I think, generally this can be, depending on the type of problem, this could be a non-trivial problem. And it's important to choose an efficient way to map your Hamiltonian. And I'll talk a little bit about what goes into that in a slide after this. So then once you have the Hamiltonian identified that you want to try to characterize, you figure out a way to map it. Then your next step is to figure out, okay, what is the actual quantum algorithm I want to run on this? Do I want to run a variational quantum eigensolver thing? Do I want to try this new sample-based quantum diagonalization technique? Do I want to just try to evolve my state in time and look at how it, changes in some way? So this step is actually preparing the quantum circuits that are associated with trying to solve the kind of problem that you actually want to do. So this might include things like choosing ansatz or creating some kind of time evolution circuit. And then the last part of this is once you have taken your circuits, you've identified all of the measurements that you want to do, you've actually run everything on a quantum computer. Then once all of the experiments have completed, you want to run any kind of necessary post-processing that you need for error mitigation or, analyzing the raw data in some way, or, some other particular kind of thing. This is where, you want to actually build up the results that you want to start presenting to show that you've, solved the problem that you were trying to solve. So what goes into mapping a problem to a quantum computing environment? Essentially what I have to do here is I have to take my description of electrons in different orbitals in a molecule, for example, and map that onto the individual states of qubits that might not be connected in the same way that these electrons can interact with each other. I also have to change the way I represent the Hamiltonian of this system into another equivalent description, but a different one that are based in the operators that you can actually execute on a quantum computer. And so there are many different ways to do this kind of thing. The most common, I would say, are the Jordan-Ringler transform, which we'll go through for a practical example, or the Bravyi-Kitaev transform, but there are many, many others. And choosing the right way to arrange the representation of your, different states that are available in the system you want to try to simulate, finding a way to represent those efficiently using a quantum computer is a really important problem to be able to solve well. Because if you don't think about it carefully, you can actually produce circuits that are very large and are very difficult to apply error suppression or error mitigation techniques and get reasonable results from. That becomes very difficult. And so this is an important component in this kind of whole workload of thinking about simulating quantum systems. Okay, so now that I have kind of an anatomy of what I need to think about when I am trying to simulate a quantum system, and I've thought a little bit about mapping it, what do I actually want to execute? What is the algorithm that I want to try to build to execute and run on a quantum computer? So I'll go over like a handful of these, and a lot of these you'll see in lectures later on that will go into a lot more depth than I can right here, and I think will be a lot better than I can present right here. So the first of these that I want to show is the variational quantum eigensolver, which you may or may not have heard of already. It's a fairly popular hybrid quantum classical approach to trying to find the ground state energy of a particular quantum system. And it essentially starts in two parts. There's the first part where you identify the ansatz that you want to use to represent all of the different wave functions that are possible in your quantum system, and hope that that ansatz is a sort of complete or fully expressible a circuit that can contain the wave functions that you want to target, specifically the ground state. And so your choice of the ansatz is very important. Essentially all it is, it's a quantum circuit with a lot of single and 2 qubit rotations, and it contains many, many, many different parameters that you can tune and adjust. And that tuning and adjusting is the sort of classical component of this algorithm, where the kind of like iteration or the workflow that you use here is you create a circuit that applies your ansatz with a given set of parameters. You take a measurement of the total energy of the system, and based on that measurement, you adjust your parameters, and then you repeat the process. And what you're trying to do is minimize that measurement of the energy to get as close an approximation of the ground state energy as you can, essentially. So again, like I said, you'll have a lecture later on, I believe, where you'll go into thinking about variational quantum algorithms in general. And the quantum eigensolver is sort of like one of these kind of canonical, relatively well-known, kind of established ones. The next one I want to talk about is this sort of like new kid on the block. It's this sample-based quantum diagonalization. And what this does is this essentially takes advantage of the symmetries of a particular problem to help you to refine the results that you get back from a quantum computer. So similar to how the variational quantum eigensolver works, you pick an ansatz, and your choice of ansatz is actually quite important, and is kind of a little bit of a heuristic and sort of difficult to do. It's tricky to do well, and there's a lot of different ways that you can approach how to build up an ansatz. So then what you do is you take this ansatz. You're not varying anything. There's no parameters. You're just trying to prepare a state that's based off of this. You're sampling the probability distribution from that state, and you're going to take those results and essentially feed them into this thing called the configuration recovery loop. And what you're doing here is you are refining the results and essentially tossing out measurements that wouldn't physically happen in your system in real life that you would try to do an experiment on. And you take advantage of knowing those rules to help refine results and identify when a measurement had some error associated with it. And so you refine the samples, you refine that probability distribution, and then from there, you select some subset of that distribution, and either in serial or in parallel, you apply classical diagonalization methods on regular classical computers to help you find eigenstates from those sort of subsets of that sample. And then you combine those results in a particular way and collect and find the lowest energy that is available from this set of samples, and the average occupancy for the state that you're trying to create with this ansatz. And so this approach has proven fairly successful. It's sort of, like I said, a new kid on the block. And I will let the next lecture on that will actually dive into this. I will leave the rest of the details to that, so that we can sort of continue on. Okay. So now what I want to do is start kind of thinking about how do I evolve systems in time using quantum computers? How do I approach this kind of quantum dynamics problem using a quantum computer? So generally, what I want to do with these kinds of time evolution or quantum dynamics problems is to implement the time evolution operator so that I can apply it to some wave function and look at how it evolves in time, or maybe how some observable that I would measure in a lab evolves in time. or I want to perturb it. I want to see what happens, or something along those lines. The goal is to implement this time evolution operator. The trouble with it is that it's composed of my Hamiltonian, and it's a matrix, and it's exponentiated. And the rules for how to split out a matrix that is exponentiated are a little different from just regular numbers. So I can't just separate out all of the components of my Hamiltonian into a product of exponentials, because I can't assume that those operators don't commute, or at least I can't do this when the operators in the Hamiltonian don't commute with each other. And so what I do is I will approximate the action of this time evolution operator by essentially making that assumption that it's kind of correct or pretty close, and taking very, very, very small little time steps along and applying my Hamiltonian along it. And what this is called is the Trotter approximation. And so there are sort of like two forms, and there are higher order approximations that you can do that are related to this. But that's kind of essentially the idea here. Is we want to take the exponential of this Hamiltonian and sort of split it out, but make the assumption that we're not going to take the splitting out and try to evolve the entire time. We're going to take very little tiny steps kind of along the way. And then the last little part of this is thinking about if I want to estimate expectation values or observables for a system that I want to try to simulate. I can use a class of algorithms called phase estimation algorithms. And so what I'll do here is kind of just, again, kind of briefly describe this. And you'll see a lecture later on, I believe, by John Montrose, who will go into much more detail on how all of this works. But essentially, there's a handful of different ways to do this. There is the sort of canonical quantum phase estimation algorithm, which is sort of listed here, which contains a really large depth circuit. There's a quantum Fourier transform involved. There's potentially very large controlled operations that are involved. And it generally has like a really high circuit depth. And it's difficult to do using our quantum computers that are available to us. There's another one called the iterative quantum phase estimation, and you can apply phase kickback. But essentially, this is kind of the approach or the algorithm you would want to try to use if you wanted to, for example, look at the expectation values for some observable given some states to characterize a quantum system, or you want to look at the phase transition of a system in some way. This would be one of the approaches to try to use. Okay, so I've given you, again, I feel a little bad. I haven't given you too much detail. I've kind of glossed over a lot of information, mostly so that we can fit in time to kind of go through this like practical example to show you how to sort of code up a relatively simple quantum dynamics kind of simulation algorithm. So what we're going to do here is we're going to take a relatively simple model called the Hubbard model, which, as you scale it up, has a lot of interesting physics. It sort of dives into strong correlations, many-body physics, and sort of large entanglement. But we're going to keep it at a relatively approachable size so that we don't have to worry too much about a lot of those details. And so what this Hamiltonian is made up of is two parts. There is a part where I am describing the ability of electrons to hop across individual sites. And I also have a part where I am describing electrons being repelled if they occupy the same site, essentially. And so to give you a little bit of a physical picture for what this could look like is, for this fairly simple one-dimensional model, what I'll say is just, let's imagine a system where I have, a handful of sites along a single chain. And at each of those sites, it could be hydrogen atoms or something else, I can host a spin up electron and maybe a spin down electron. And I want to understand how do the electrons behave over time? And I want to use quantum computers to try to do it. Another part of this that I wanted to mention too is that this representation is written in a formalism called second quantization. And none of these operators in second quantization are immediately executable on a quantum circuit. So we have to figure out a way to map this problem, essentially. And the way we do that is, say, instead of, individual sites hosting 2 electrons, I have to think about how do I map these possible states onto a quantum computer, onto individual qubits. And so what I'll do is, in my arrangement of a QPU, I can look at how the qubits are connected to each other. And a relatively simple approach is to say, okay, if I have, a chain of 5 sites, I'll have 5 qubits along a line where the spin up electrons can be hosted. And then I'll have 5 qubits further along the line where spin down electrons can be hosted. And so what I'll do then is apply this thing called the Jordan-Wingler transform. And essentially how this works is I'm going to map the second quantization operators, which are also called the creation and annihilation operators, onto the Pauli operators that are actually accessible on my quantum computer. And when I do the math, when I sit down and go through it, this is kind of how this whole thing actually gets set up. So the Hamiltonian, instead of the sort of like C dagger C things, are going to be just like Pauli X and Pauli Y rotations. And then when I look at this term in my Hamiltonian, I will instead have this I minus Z kind of representation. And my whole Hamiltonian will have this description. So we'll go ahead and move on to actually coding this up into a relatively simple algorithm, and look at the evolution of a single electron as it kind of like moves around this chain. What I'm going to do now is sort of like go through this kind of pre-baked, relatively quick code example of trying to simulate the evolution of an interesting quantum system. So back in the slides, the thing that I mentioned that we'll do is we're going to go through and simulate the evolution of a Hubbard model, or of a 1D chain Hubbard model. And the initial state that we'll use is basically, if you want to think sort of a rough kind of conceptual idea of what we're doing with this experiment, is we're going to take our 1D chain and we're going to plop a single electron in that chain, and we're going to let the system evolve in some amount of time, and we're going to look at the probability distribution of where that electron is, which particular site it lives in, as a function of time. So it'll produce like a nice little pretty plot, and I think we'll demonstrate some of the sort of different Qiskit tools that will be helpful for us. So I'll kind of go over the import statements that we'll need to kind of give you an idea of like what objects we're using and what kind of tools. The other thing I'll actually also preface is that we won't dive into actually using a quantum computer in this example, just because mostly for time, as well as the way the circuit is constructed, or the way this experiment is built, would require a fair amount of error mitigation techniques, error suppression, and maybe other kinds of interesting approaches like circuit cutting or something along those lines to actually produce anything that sort of looks reasonable. But what I want to do here is kind of show you what ideally it would look like if we had a fault-tolerant quantum computer, for example. So to kind of go through the import statements, we're just importing the typical quantum circuit, quantum register, classical register as you would. Importing the preset path manager generation function. We'll be using the sparse Pauli op to help us actually build the Hamiltonian. We will use parameters as well to represent the time step that we want to apply, that we want to evolve our system with. We'll also use this really handy function from the Qiskit circuit library called the evolved operator ansatz, which will basically take our Hamiltonian as is written in terms of Pauli operators. And what it will do is it will spit back out the circuit that will evolve that system in time, given this a set of Trotter slices to use and the proper approximation that you want to try to use. So then after that, we'll import IBM runtime things, but we won't actually use these in this example. We'll import some related matplotlib things and the state vector sampler to actually run to actually simulate the quantum circuit. Okay, so essentially what I've done kind of here is I've kind of pre-baked two separate functions. One to actually construct the Hamiltonian for a particular kind of system. So I can choose the number of sites that I want to represent my system with. I can choose the hopping energy and I can choose the repulsion energy. So how easy would it be for electrons to hop across in this system I'm simulating, or how much are electrons repelled against each other in this system I'm simulating? And the second part of this will be utilizing this function, the evolved operator ansatz, which will actually help us generate our circuits to actually accomplish the time evolution goal that we have to try to, do this experiment, essentially. The one thing I'll quickly point out is that, like I mentioned, the initial state we want to prepare is just we want to plop a single electron in this chain and let it evolve over time. So we're going to start with just applying a single X gate to it before we actually apply the time evolution circuit. So you'll see here I can construct my Hamiltonian. I have a set of system parameters that I've sort of chosen. A fun little experiment that you could do if you wanted was to sort of play around with these and see how, see what happens, see how they work, see what kinds of interesting things you can kind of try to explore or figure out or be curious about. I'll also show how what the actual quantum circuits look like that will be running on, our simulator, but on a quantum computer later on. And so if I essentially choose just a single, if I choose not to do any time evolution, what I'll do is just place a single X gate on one of my qubits, and that'll be my representation of plopping a single electron in one of the orbitals sort of along my chain. If I apply one of these steps, what I'll do then is it will apply the Hamiltonian that I've written for this kind of system and apply its exponential after a Trotter approximation. And I can choose to apply this, however many times I would like, essentially, which is what we'll do in order to be able to look at how this system behaves and evolves over time. Okay, so the next part of this, what it will do is I'm going to construct a set of circuits that will simulate the evolution of this single electron evolving or, moving around on this chain as a function of time. And for each step, for each, time point that I want to sample from, I have to create a separate circuit for it. So this is essentially the step that I do here. So I create a pass manager to transpile my circuits. I construct the evolve circuit for the particular time step that I want to simulate that circuit to. I apply measurement instructions, and then I, add it to a long list, basically. So I'll run that. And then the next thing I'll do is actually run the circuits on a given backend. So this is where I could separate out and actually run this on a real backend. Part of why I'm not going to do it here is because the circuit depth is too large. And if I go into the details of how to optimize this, I think this lecture would be a little too long. So I'm going to leave that as an exercise for you to try to figure out. Like, if I wanted to try to run this on a real quantum computer, what would I do to try to optimize it? So for now, we're just going to run the state vector sampler to just execute the circuit as if it was a noiseless, sort of fault-tolerant quantum computer. And I print all of the job IDs out, but I don't exactly need it. This can be helpful for example, if your workload requires you to run a lot of circuits and you're probably going to wait a while for results, you can take these job IDs and store them somewhere, maybe in a file or something, so that you can pull them out later so that you can then process the results once they get back to you. Okay, so what I want to do here is I want to just sort of like quickly kind of go over the structure of the results that you usually get back from a quantum computer. Because it's sort of it can be a little unintuitive sometimes. So what I'll do is I'll show you what the result get. When I use the sampler primitive, the result I get is a thing called a primitive result, which is a list which contains one or more pub results based on if I was using the sampler or the estimator. So since I only have one pub result to look at, I'll just look at the first element. And this element has an attribute called data, which is in the form of this data bin object. And if I want to take this data bin object, I can use this sort of convenient little get counts function. And what this will do is this will tell me, okay, based on the number, how many times was my measurement outcome measured based on when I was using the sampler, and what the corresponding measurement bit string was. And so in this kind of post-processing of all of my results, what I'm doing is I'm taking the data that I get back from these counts. I'm going to refine the results a little bit by tossing out the ones that I know shouldn't be there based on noise, and changing all of that count data to a probability distribution to show what the occupancy looks like for each site kind of as a function of time. And I think this it won't take very long at all. And what I'll do then is I'll create a nice little evolution. So to kind of give you a little bit of an anatomy of like how this plot actually works is as a function of time, what I'm looking at is the probability of an electron occupying a particular mode, a particular site with a particular spin. And so you can see the electron that I kind of plopped in there starts off kind of just definitely being in the very first site, but you see over time that probability sort of spreads out. So here I have a another little visualization of the probability of occupation of each site as a function of time. And what you may notice is you only get some non-zero probability for one half of this chain, while the other half has nothing in it. And the reason for that is that in my little very simple example, all I did was placed one spin up electron in one of the sites, and I didn't add any other electrons, and I didn't do anything to change the spin of this electron that I'm simulating, or sort of perturb that. And so because of that, none of my probability distribution sort of dips into the other spin sector that I use to map this 1D Hubbard chain to a quantum computing environment. Okay, so I hope this was helpful, kind of gave a relatively simple, helpful, quick introduction to quantum simulation, the related concepts, and what goes into it. There's plenty more details that I glossed over. And I would love to hear questions from y'all. And hopefully this provides something of a little bit of a springboard for you to investigate more about how to start thinking about simulating quantum systems using quantum computers. Thanks.